Darkness hung over the city like a judgment waiting to fall. Sodom was still asleep, unaware of the countdown that had already begun. The streets were quiet, but beneath the silence lived the echo of cruelty, of corruption, of years of sin hardened into stone. Even the wind held its breath, as though creation itself knew what was coming. Lot stood at the door of his house, eyes fixed on the horizon. The dawn was still distant, but a faint glow stirred in the east. Whether it was morning or something else, he couldn't tell. Inside, his wife moved frantically, gathering what she could: cloth, bread, silver. Her hands shook, but she didn't speak. There were no words left, only dread. The night before, two strangers had arrived in the square, men who looked ordinary but spoke with voices that shook the soul. Lot had offered them shelter, not knowing exactly why, only that it felt necessary. Then came the pounding on the door, the demands, the threats. The city he had once called home had shown its face, and now the mask was gone. The angels, yes, that's what they were, had pulled Lot back from the mob, blinded the attackers with light not of this world, and shut the door with finality. And then the words had come: "Take your wife, your daughters. Leave this place." Now, they had hesitated. All of them, even Lot, as if years of compromise had rooted their feet in the soil of this cursed city. But the angels did not wait. They seized them, physically, and led them outside, into the cool edge of dawn. And then, the final command: flee for your lives. Do not look back. Do not stop. Run to the mountains, or you will be swept away. Lot's wife had not spoken then. She hadn't needed to. The fear in her eyes was loud enough. She looked back once at the gate of the city, not with longing, not yet, just with disbelief. They ran. The morning light broke in slashes of fire across the sky. Smoke was rising in the distance, black and curling and thick. The wind picked up, and the smell in the air changed. It wasn't smoke from hearth fires. It was sulfur, burning earth, wrath. Their feet stumbled over rocks as they left the plains. Lot's daughters cried out, falling and rising again. Lot urged them forward, gasping for breath. Behind them, the light grew, red, then orange, then blinding white. The heavens rumbled. The ground shook. But she, Lot's wife, she heard it too. The sound, a low roar, like the collapse of worlds. It came from behind. Not just sound, but feeling. Heat pressing against her back. Screams echoing faintly, or maybe only in her mind. A city undone. And with every step forward, something in her pulled her back. Her memories lived there. Her home. Her friends. The market she visited every morning. The walls they had painted. The life they had built. This wasn't just a city. It was everything they had ever known. Even if it was wicked. Even if God himself had warned them. Even if angels had dragged them to safety. It was hers. And so, just once, she looked back. It wasn't a long look. It was quick. Barely more than a glance. But it was enough. It was not the kind of look that comes from concern. It was not to check on others, or to see if the daughters had kept up. It was a look rooted in the heart. In regret. In resistance. It was the kind of look that says, I still belong there. And in that instant, everything changed. Her body froze. Her breath caught mid-step. Lot turned at the sound, maybe a gasp, maybe a silence that shouldn't have been. And she was no longer moving. She stood still, her eyes wide open, her hand still reaching forward, caught between fleeing and falling. The firestorm behind her lit up the sky, and the blast of judgment raced across the plains. And she was gone, not consumed, transformed. Her body, once flesh and breath, was now cold and hard. A pillar, salt, a monument not of stone, but of warning. Frozen forever in the moment she looked back. Lot fell to his knees. The daughters screamed, but there was no time to grieve. The heat surged. The ground shook again. From the hills above, they could see it now, Sodom and Gomorrah, swallowed in fire. The valley glowed like a furnace. The smoke rose like a signal to heaven. God had done what he said, and she had not listened. They kept running, stumbling, weeping, climbing toward the mountains where judgment could not reach. Lot didn't look back again. He didn't speak. His daughters were silent now too. Shock wrapped around them like a second skin. By the time they reached the cave, the world below had changed forever. Rain did not fall, only ash and silence. Lot sat at the entrance of the cave, staring down at the valley, though he could barely see. The wind had shifted. Smoke covered everything. But he knew where she had fallen. He knew where she still stood, facing the ruins of what once was. A pillar on the edge of mercy. He closed his eyes, but sleep would not come. Not that night. Not for many nights after. There are some moments that split a life in two. Before and after. She had been his wife, the mother of his children, his partner in the journey. She had left with him from Sodom, but not from her heart. Her body had followed the command, but her soul stayed behind. And now she was a warning for all who would follow, that the cost of looking back can be everything. Even now, when the wind rises across the salt plains of the Dead Sea, travelers say they can still see her there, frozen, staring toward a city that no longer exists. Not because she hated God, but because she loved the world too much to let go. The fire had fallen, but it wasn't just judgment. It was mercy too. God had pulled Lot out, had sent messengers, had offered rescue, had waited, but he would not wait forever. And when the final moment came, the choice had to be made. Go forward or perish with the past. She chose the past, and she became part of it. They didn't speak for a long time. Not the first day, not the second, not even when the sun rose again and warmed the stones outside the cave. Lot sat at the entrance, staring into the emptiness, his knees pulled to his chest, his hands dusty and still. The wind came in gentle waves, stirring ash into the sky. It brought with it no scent of the city, only silence. The cries were gone. The flames were gone. The valley below was now a wasteland. No voices, no laughter, no life, just smoke. He had once had servants, herds, a household too large to fit in a single place. He had chosen the green plains of Sodom over the rugged hills where Abraham stayed, because it seemed fruitful, wealthy, easier. But now he sat in a cave. His wife was gone. The city he had chosen was gone. And the man who had once sat at Sodom's gate, respected among the people, now had only rock walls and silence for company. His daughters moved around him quietly, gathering sticks, lighting small fires, baking flat cakes with trembling hands. They didn't speak of their mother. They didn't ask where she had fallen. They had seen enough to understand what silence was for. At night, they lay close together on the cold cave floor, whispering beneath their breath. There was no one left. No people. No future. No name to carry forward. They were all that remained of their family line, and fear began to speak in their minds. What happens when a name dies? What happens when no children are born? What if this is the end of everything? There had been no laws, no scripture, no voice from heaven to tell them what was right. Only terror, trauma, and the weight of fire still burning in their memories. And in that confusion, they made a plan. It was not born from wickedness. It was born from desperation. On the first night, the eldest took the wine, left over from the city, and pressed it into her father's hand. His eyes were hollow, his lips cracked. He drank without asking why. And when he was no longer aware of where he lay, she went to him. He did not know when she came. He did not know when she left. The next night, the younger did the same. Again, he drank. Again, he did not know. And when the months passed, and the girls began to show, there were no questions. Only quiet. And the unspoken truth that what had been done in darkness had now taken root in life. The elder gave birth first. A son. She named him Moab, from father. The younger followed. Another son. She called him Ben-Ami, son of my people. 2 boys born from sorrow, from a cave, from confusion and fear. But 2 boys who would become nations. Moab would grow, and his people would one day rise against Israel, tempting them with idolatry, warring against them in the wilderness. Ben-Ammi's line would become the Ammonites, fierce and unrelenting, settling east of the Jordan, always circling the borders of promise, but never entering in. Both would stand as reminders of what happens when fear overtakes faith, of what happens when survival clouds obedience. And yet, God would still weave their names into his story. Generations later, from Moab's line, a woman would be born, a widow, a foreigner. Her name would be Ruth, and she would leave her people, cleave to Israel, and marry a man of Judah. From her womb would come kings, and from her bloodline, centuries later, would come the Christ. God would redeem what had begun in darkness. But Lot would never know that. He lived the rest of his days in quiet. The man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Abraham now lived as a ghost of who he had been. He had escaped the judgment of fire, but not the weight of memory. Sometimes survival is not victory. Sometimes the greatest mercy is that we're allowed to live, so we might learn. Lot had pitched his tent towards Sodom long ago, drawn by the glitter of comfort, the illusion of peace. He had chosen what looked good, what seemed easy. But Sodom was never just a place. It was a spirit. And even when God pulled him out, not all of it left him. Not all of it left his family. Some of it still followed them into the hills. And even now, the story lingers. A pillar stands near the ruins of the Dead Sea, though no one knows if it's truly her. The salt is thick in the air. The land is barren. And travelers still wonder what she saw in that final look. What was it that turned her heart back when the command was so clear? Why did she hesitate when mercy had already begun? Perhaps it was love, or longing, or the part of us that always clings to what God asks us to leave behind. But the judgment was not just for her. It was for all of us. Because when God says go, there is no safety in looking back. The days passed, but the quiet never left. The days passed, but the quiet never left. No one came to visit. The world had become a much smaller place. The sounds of cities, of herds, of voices calling out across fields. Those were all memories now, echoes of a life that had been swept away in one long, burning night. Lot aged quickly in the mountains. Not in body, his strength remained, but in spirit. His face grew lined not just by the wind, but by the burden of choices made long ago. He rarely spoke. His eyes carried the distance of a man who had seen too much. Sometimes, he would sit at the mouth of the cave and stare into the valley below. Not because he expected to see her, the woman he had lost. Not because he hoped for news from Abraham, but because he didn't know where else to look. There was nowhere else to go. The world below was gone. The fertile fields he had once envied, the vineyards and stone walls and well-watered gardens, all gone. The judgment had been swift, complete. His daughters tended to their children in silence. They never spoke of what had happened, never mentioned that night. They grew tired before their time. Their faces were hard, their hands calloused, their joy gone. The boys grew quickly. 2 children born of confusion, of survival, of desperation. Lot watched them as they played in the dust, unaware of the shadows cast over their birth. They were innocent, and yet they were reminders, living reminders. Moab, Ben-Ammi, sons of the cave, sons of a broken past, sons of a man who had once stood beside the friend of God and now lived among the rocks. Lot rarely looked them in the eye, because to look at them was to remember everything. To remember the garden he once left behind. To remember the moment he pitched his tent towards Sodom, drawn by its wealth, its ease, its promise of plenty. To remember the gates of the city, where he sat among leaders, respected, established, until respect cost him his soul. To remember the angel's warning and his hesitation. To remember her. The final look. The silence that followed. He carried all of it now. Alone. Abraham never came. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he didn't know where to find him. Or maybe he knew. Perhaps he knew that some journeys must be walked in solitude. That some consequences can't be rescued. That some lessons can only be learned in the long silence of loss. And perhaps that's why God let Lot live. Not as a punishment, but as a warning. Not all judgment looks like fire from the sky. Sometimes it looks like memory. Sometimes it sounds like silence. Sometimes it feels like a life that could have been, but now never will. And so Lot stayed. And the seasons turned. The boys grew strong, wild like the hills that raised them. They spoke in a language shaped by absence. They asked no questions. Lot gave no answers. Their people would one day be known for their pride, their strength, their resistance to God's chosen. But here, they were still only children, climbing rocks, chasing shadows, laughing without knowing what their laughter cost. And Lot, he would one day fade from the story. No great ending, no restoration arc, no return to Abraham, no burial beside the patriarchs. He had escaped the fire, but not the fracture. And his name would linger in Scripture not as a hero, but as a man who was pulled from the brink, by mercy, only to live out the rest of his days among the consequences. He was the man who believed enough to follow the angels, but not enough to flee before being dragged. He was the man who survived, but lost nearly everything in the process. And he was the man whose wife turned back, just once, and never returned. There is something haunting about Lot's story, not just because of what was destroyed, but because of what survived. The ashes are easier to understand than the cave. Fire and brimstone make sense. But silence, years of silence, a man and his regrets and the ghosts of what might have been, that's harder, but it's real. And maybe that's why his story remains. Not as a tale of fire, but as a warning written in salt. A reminder of what happens when we live too close to the edge, too close to compromise, too deep in comfort to hear the voice that tells us to run. When we stay too long in places we were meant to leave. When we delay. When we look back. Lot's story doesn't end with death. It ends with legacy. 2 boys. They will grow. They will war. They will shape the destiny of Israel. And one day, through them, despite them, God will write something redemptive. But that is a story for another time. Lot sits with the weight of his choices. And down below, the land once called Sodom smolders beneath the sun, silent forever. Thank you for watching Lot's Wife. The final look, the full story. If you've made it this far, subscribe for more cinematic retellings of the Bible's rawest, most powerful stories. Hit the bell so you'll know when the next one drops. Because the story isn't over. In the next episode, we follow the path of the survivors, how Abraham responds, how Ruth is born from ashes, how God turns even the darkest chapters into the roots of redemption. This is only the beginning. See you in the next one. Grace and peace.